So once you have things set up and it's there, how do you get to that data? How do you get to this index of your data of your element store of your cluster to determine what you have within the system? So there's a couple different ways of going through and doing that. We provide, first off, through the web UI. The web UI has a very powerful utility to go through and say, hey, I want to look at these files here with some simple ands and or statements to go through, identify the data that you want for that. We can do this through the CLI. So we do have a CLI element, a couple different variations of a CLI to interface with this. There's a Python SDK we can go through and utilize to access the VAST database. We can make use of calls directly to the REST API. To go through and get that information as well. The most interesting one, though, is the query engines with that. Again, it is a database, so we could write SQL directly against it, but the query engines allow us some additional flexibility. We'll talk about that on how to start. So the initial access here, if we're using the web UI or the REST API type interfaces there, all this requires is VMS access and permissions. So if you have a user that is able to log into VMS for that, or has the right permissions within VMS to go through and access the database or the databases that are on there, that's all that you need. You don't need to go through and set anything else up for that. You can go through and make queries directly against the REST API. And I'll show you some examples as to how you can go through and do that. Anything else, if we're talking about making use of the query engines there, we would need to go through and we would need to make use of the access key or identity policies and create some S3 access keys for users to go through and interface this. This is a little different method for it, whereas if we're doing it through the REST API and the web UI for access, we would be going in strictly through the VMS management interface on the VMS network or the management network. This other access here is going to come in through the VIP pools. And this is where things like the rest of the database makes things very powerful, because we can spread these queries out. Not that necessarily the catalog needs it, but other database operations will make use of it much better use of it there. But we can go through and spread these out across the VIP pools on the front end CNAME. So you would need to have access into one of the VIP pools for that from whatever client machine you're going through and running this. So setting this up, again, is going to be relatively simple to go through and do, and it's outlined in the documentation for VAST. But basically, the process is you create an identity policy, you associate a user with the identity policy, and then generate the S3 access keys for that particular user. So let's talk about what needs to be done here and how that gets done. So this screenshot here, I'll point this out. This is from 5.3. This is the current release version of that. The screen, if you're looking at 5.2 or 5.1 or 5.0 for that, this screen might look a little bit different, but generally the concept is still the same. The flags are still the same here for that. So in order to go through and create a identity policy, we navigate to the GUI. Or however you want to go through and create your identity policy, navigate into the GUI, go into user management, identity policies, and create a new policy. The policy is going to be, call it whatever you wish to go through and do. In this case, I'm using VAST catalog access, but we need to grant it some rights. Now, there's some special rights here, some special actions that are used, specifically the S3 tabular query data access that is needed for being able to do these types of queries there. So we need to allow that type of action to occur for that. And then we can go through and we can specify a specific resource. Now, the VAST catalog is, even though we're accessing over S3 and it is a database, it is treated special. It is treated separately, meaning it doesn't show up necessarily as a bucket listing or a bucket that's listed. It doesn't go through and show up. It's not a manipulatable database. It's fixed. So we need to give it specifically access to the VAST-catalog-bucket is the database that is used for this. So we go through, we create this identity policy, say create and save it, and then we go through and we assign this to a user. Now, this user can either be a locally defined user, meaning I've created a user in one of the local providers, a local user on the cluster on this, or it could be a user that's tied into Active Directory or LDAP or something like that. But what we need to do here is we need to go through, we need to query for that user, locate that user for this. So in the case here, I've done a search for my user called catalog user. And I'm going to go through and I need to generate some S3 keys for this. I can come here and say, click on add new key. And again, your screens may be different depending on the VAST version that you're using, but it's the same kind of concept. And then we go through and we select which identity policies we wish to go through and use via this drop down here. So we put those three things together, and this would allow us to go through and use those queries as this user to use those keys as this user to access the VAST database. So relatively simple to go through and set up. But let's talk about how we can go through and how we can do some of these other queries there internally without going through that process. So let's start with the web UI interface. So first off, for the web UI interface, it's going to be very simple and intuitive for this. As the VAST catalog, as I mentioned before, is a database within VAST, as in the VAST audit log, very similar concept there. But we would go through and within the GUI, we navigate down to database, which is an option, VAST catalog, and we'd be presented with a screen, and we would have a query panel that we can go through and open up. We also see in here, the tenant that we're going through and querying, because we do maintain isolation a bit between different tenants. For this is part of our secure multi-tenancy. I don't want tenant A to be able to search catalog data for tenant B or tenant C. So we do isolate those out. We do that here, we represent that here in the GUI as well. So we would select which tenant we wish to use. If you're not using multi-tenancy, it's always going to be default. For that, and then which frame we're going through and using. By default, the catalog, these queries will default to the latest frame. All the queries will default to the latest frame. There are options to say, hey, I want to use an older frame for those if I want to search older data on this, but always go with the most current one that we have. And then from there, we have this nice drop-down menu that gives us our list of columns. Am I searching for the UID? Am I searching for creation time of a particular file? And then what type of operation? I want to, say my UID of 33443, or my Windows SID of this, or my username of this. I can go through and do that. I can say my creation time is after a certain date. So we would put these together, and depending upon how we set up these queries, each condition we add in is going to be treated like an AND statement. If I want to make an OR statement as part of that, I can just attach that together with those, and we'll go through and run the query. And we'll go through and execute this. So here, I'm looking for all the files created by UID 33443, which is my NFS user ID on this. And I'm looking for all the files that I have created since January, or since April 1st. So we'll go through, it runs the query, and it pulls out all this information. Now, within the VAST catalog, or within the GUI, it's going to go through and show us all the columns, all the fields that are available there. So we could scroll back and forth on this menu that gets presented here and see all the different fields that we want. For this, I can also go through the drop-down menu or the column menu here. I can select which columns I wish to go through and have displayed. So again, we can look at this, we can get these results based on those queries there. And if I want to, I can go through and simply by right-clicking anywhere in the screen here, I'll get an option to say, hey, I want to export this data either as a CSV file or as an Excel spreadsheet that you can go through and import into something else. So, pretty simple, easy to go through and use with it. So again, pointing this out here for 5.3 specifically for this is that we do have the notion of a cluster admin and a tenant admin. Cluster admins can go through and query per tenant. They can query any tenant in the system. Tenant admins are limited only to their own tenant if you're using those. Prior to 5.3, there wasn't really the notion of a cluster admin for that. There's other restrictions in there in terms of some of the roles as to where things can be queried, but everyone effectively is a cluster admin in 5.2 for that. So again, very simple to go through and use. You can do some basic but pretty powerful queries for these here to get this information out of the system. Again, it's going to be updated as often as you're taking those frames. So that's one option.